2, 1. Welcome to one of our first presentations on connecting and securing the enterprise for DreamCon 2020. With me today is Patrick Poulin, the CEO of API Fortress, and he's going to talk us today through the importance of functional testing as part of an API security plan. And obviously, as part of our connecting and securing the enterprise theme, we are obviously pushing an API-led strategy in regards to any digital transformation and application development moving forward. And API Fortress have a very unique and interesting product that enables and really accelerates that security planning that comes with such an enterprise scale. So Patrick, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit about API Fortress, and we can kick on?
Sure. So I'm Patrick Poulin from API Fortress, one of the co-founders here and the CEO. Just a little bit about who we are. So API Fortress is an API testing and monitoring platform. We've been around since about 2014. It's really when we started building it at its core. And so since then, we've had thousands of customers, like hundreds of companies, like thousands of users, run billions of tests. But really our primary focus is we're a platform with tooling around it as well that's really dedicated to the functional testing, the load testing, and the monitoring of your APIs. So I guess I'll just sort of dive right into it. Something that we like to speak to often and that's sort of underrated is people always talk about security and they're talking about getting breaches. And you want to think it's like Hollywood and they're hackers, they're doing amazing things. But the reality is that 95% of these security breaches are just human error. It's literally all it is. And oftentimes it would have been caught by a proper testing. And I don't mean security testing. I literally mean like a functional test done right or a load test or something would have kept them from having these huge security breaches. And like, I don't use my own numbers, like Gartner themselves said 95% are just human error. And don't forget, everything runs off APIs now. Like this is 83% of all the web traffic. So it's doubly important to we're building APIs, like companies like Dream Factory make it so easy to rapidly build and iterate on new APIs, but the testing of it has to stay up to date with it. You can't fall behind in testing because then you're just releasing things into the void without having some reassurance that it's actually in a good place functionally. So there's actually on our blog, we talk about some of these breaches that are more functional and not hackers. And these are huge ones. So I'm going to sort of dive into them individually just to concrete this a little bit more. I don't want to talk just in theory. So one of the first ones is Twitter. And so what Twitter had, well, it was really interesting. So when you sign up for a Twitter account, it can actually look in your contacts, find the phone numbers and connect them with your friends. So all right, they have, we have Luke's phone number. Perfect. That means you're friends with Luke. This is Luke's Twitter account. Connect to that phone number. Let's connect you. Well, they made this, it's a good idea in theory, but one of the major problems is they didn't do any rate limiting on it. And so what was happening is these third, bad actor countries, like the North Koreas and, the Middle East, some of the Middle Eastern countries, they were using that. And so what they were doing is they were just guessing phone numbers or finding phone numbers of individuals and trying to find, using this API, their Twitter accounts. The problem is not everyone's Twitter is meant to be publicly consumed or is connected with their LinkedIn or something. Some people like to tweet just very privately, but that level of privacy is completely stripped if you know someone's number and you just check to see what their Twitter is. And then you can start finding these people that are just saying things they shouldn't be saying professionally. Now, the reality is they probably shouldn't have a Twitter and be doing those things to begin with, but just again, it's just, it was a good idea. It's a feature idea, but they didn't test that there was rate limiting. And without rate limiting, you lead yourself open to that sort of getting taken advantage to that level. There's another huge breach in India that was really interesting. More specifically, what happened there is that to create an account with an energy company, there's an API that validates your social security number. That's not exactly what it is, but that's an American equivalent. So they can look at your social security number, prove that you're a real person in good standing, and then they'll let you create your energy account online. Now, one of the problems they had was, first, this API where you validate if someone's in good standing with everyone's, like all this personal social security stuff info, was public. It wasn't behind any sort of firewall or required any sort of like whitelisting, like it was actually public. That's just a huge screw up right there, but that's not a hack. It's just public. There wasn't any sort of weird hacking done. Then the second part is actually, it came into the same issue. They didn't have rate limiting working properly. So what you can do is just guess every single social security number on earth. And if you hit it, it would come back with all of this personal identification information. So what you would have at that moment is not only their name and address, but also their social security number all in one. And all you have to do is just guess a bunch of numbers until you hit it. An unbelievable breach. And there's 1.1 billion people that are on this API. So that's just one of the biggest ones ever. But what I just described to you are just the way they set it up wasn't great, but it wasn't a huge hack. It was a functional error, and they didn't do a load test to validate that there was throttling, for example. And so the last one that's
sorry, this one here, Patrick, this one probably speaks most back to your point about human error, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned this is a huge API, multiple access. The actual API in itself is probably doing the exact function they needed it to do, but the fact that it was the way they were actually, being able to get it to access the API was the critical error. It was the human side of the house.
Exactly. The thing that I always like to convey, so I meet companies, a lot of startups have this theory now where it's, oh, we don't have QAs, our developers are writing the tests. But that leads to a huge issue that it happens at every company. It's always a problem long term. So you have 10 endpoints created by 10 developers. They each have their own, and they create a test for their endpoints. They're probably they're all testing in a different way. But what happens when we're talking about testing that? What if they're supposed to integrate? So let's say it's search, add to cart, checkout. What person's testing that all three of them work in one flow? Because each developer is siloed to his endpoint. So who's doing the negative testing? So a professional tester thinks of these sort of negative scenarios, especially the next one, which is the United States Postal Service. This one was just a basic test, a basic negative test. You're able to search by your tracking number and get a bunch of personal information about a person in the United States. 60 million people are on this database. What you could do is, if you knew your long, detailed tracking number, you would get this information. So they did rate limit it. So that wasn't the issue. The issue they had was even more significant. If you searched by wildcard, it gave you everyone. That's all you had to do. You had to push in a wildcard, and it gave you everyone's information. And that's just a basic negative test. Like if you have a QA team that isn't testing, well, what happens when I search with an exclamation point or a wildcard or a question mark? What sort of results? Like that's just basic negative functional testing. They didn't do that, and it was unbelievable. And it took months. Like it ends up being these security experts looking for the stuff that find these things.
Do you think part of that is pressure on developers to get a product live and in production, and therefore they're not actually considering that, taking a step back and getting a third party eyes onto it, or a third party testing tool to look at it before it actually moves into production?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think it's a combination of two things. The first is when people start cutting budgets, they go to QA first. And the second is when people want to digitally transform, quote unquote, they're going to APIs and finding these platforms that help them build them so rapidly, while at the same time undermining their QA team. Those two things are being built up together. You have more APIs going out with less checking on them. And so that's what's been happening at all of these large enterprises over and over again. We see it every day.
Yeah.
So just to take it back, like what is the fundamental problem and how to fix it? It's just a question of, there's a lot of buzzwords and things like that, but we just call it like continuous quality. So for us, what that means is the functionality of the API. Is it up? But not just is it up, but is it up and functioning? That's a hyper-specific differentiation that people aren't paying enough attention to, that we'll go into a little bit more detail in a bit. Then the last one is just general security. But again, that could just mean not making a private API public. There's a lot of good security platforms out there, but let's not forget about the easy stuff, such as don't make this API public.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in there as too, regarding one of the ways Dream Factory actually satisfies that is a Dream Factory API through its auto generation actually can't be made public until it is secured. So by default, you're not going to have a live API before you actually have applied appropriate role-based access control, assigned that API a user, assigned it to an application, and then, and only then, are you able to push it into production. So I think from an API development perspective, having controls like that in place, if you're spinning up multiple APIs through a, in a programmatic fashion, it's important to ensure that you're not just pushing them straight into production without the appropriate security layer, for sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's what's really interesting about that stuff is to be mindful of when you push it to production, it's going to be different. How you're testing it's going to be different. And there's this unfortunate pattern we see where testing stops at pre-production. And then once it's pushed live, they haven't checked it again a final time, or they should be checking continuously, but at least one more time, and think about like those security issues, as you said, like double checking that the security is in place as it needs to be. And again, this all just comes back to functionality of how it is in production, and how you're testing it can lead to these catastrophic breaches. So in terms of like continuous quality, it's the easiest way for us to show it and visualize it is basically you need to build a bunch of functional tests and integration tests or end-to-end tests. So, for e-commerce, search, add to cart, checkout is like a regular consumer flow. That should be one test. You want to do a bunch of individual tests as well, but you want to figure out what 90% of your consumers do as flows and do those in one smart test, and then do positive and negative testing. And so create this entire suite of really robust tests, and then leverage them for all the things you need to achieve this continuous quality. And so obviously there's automated testing. So as part of like a CI pipeline, if you're using that, for example, automate all that testing as part of a CI pipeline. But then also don't forget about performance testing, load testing, stress testing. But you should be using these actual functional and end-to-end tests as your load tests. Like you should be seeing how your platform works under 5,000 user hits of one flow. Not just 5,000 pings, but 5,000 flows. That's the only way you could actually validate this stuff. And we see that not happening all the time, because someone will be writing a test in SOAP UI, but then they'll be doing their load testing using JMeter. And that's great. They've found two open source tools, but by not connecting them, the load test is all but useless. It only gives you a little bit of information, but doesn't give you a true test of how it's going to work with 5,000 actual human beings hitting it, for example. And those things just aren't connecting.
And just to point on your the load test and monitoring isn't valuable if you're not producing a normal consumer flow. I'd suggest that it's also prudent to go a little bit above and beyond, right? Because you're going to get those days where you have a spike or you have an increase in usage or calls, and therefore the system needs to be robust enough to warrant those spikes. So I feel like it's also prudent to move a little bit beyond, because it's inconsequential from a testing perspective. You're just pushing to that upper limit, right? It's not a matter of testing your average, it's testing the spread that I think is also important.
Yeah, and also not just testing it occasionally, but on every release. So like, I mean, with our platform, but there are other platforms too, like whatever system you want to use or whether you want to build it in-house. As part of your automated functional tests, you can also execute load tests. And then you have that historical track of seeing what this latest code does, whether it's a performance dip or improvement or what have you. But all of that should run off the same series of really robust tests. Then the last part is monitoring. And this is the part that's really becoming more important these days than previous. It's using functional tests as monitors. So what we're saying that's unique is not only are people monitoring production using functional tests, which is sort of like our bread and butter, honestly, but they're actually using it to validate internal environments. So all sorts of different tiers of internal environments, including dev environments. What I'm actually seeing these days is like there's so many automated tests within a CI pipeline. They've decided to not clog up the build, take it out of there, and actually just run the tests on a schedule every 5 minutes against that environment, so that the build doesn't require the automated tests to run, but the automatic tests are always running. And so they'll know like, all right, this test just failed. Most recent build was X, so that's what it failed off of. Then they can go back. That's just because they're, these are the companies we're working with, they're doing really well in terms of keeping their testing up to date with the track that they have in terms of building APIs. And so it's keeping those things head to head. And so that's been an interesting development it's worth mentioning. I'm seeing more and more very technological companies getting away from actually just clogging their CI/CD pipeline with automated tests and just running it all on a schedule.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said if we dial back to that initial security layer as well. If you're a company or your API framework satisfies both external facing APIs and internal APIs for consumption, the ability to monitor internal consumption and do the testing and the monitoring of those is just as important, because if you haven't secured them properly, or your authentication layer is quite liberal in that internal, you might have people interacting with an API that don't necessarily need to be, or pushing certain calls through that unnecessarily, right? And without monitoring those internal APIs as well as the externally consumed APIs, you're going to run into trouble.
Totally. So all of those three things off of the core of tests. So just very quickly, like, what's a good functional test? And this might seem kind of dumb to some people, but it's actually like, we only deal with enterprise organizations, and it's unbelievable how often this is not being done. So it's worth saying out loud is, obviously an API, it's a bunch of data. I almost think of it as a book. And so you should be proofreading every single line of that book constantly. And with that comes the focus on validating all of it. So with that, like, actual like book analogy, like not just the objects exist, but like the data associated with the object has to be read as well. With that book analogy, it's actually interesting. One of our first customers was a book publisher that had a partner API. So their API gave you a listing of all their books that were in print, and it was a very large book company. So they had a lot of books in print. So they had this API that they would send out to, let's say, a book publisher, who would ingest it and then know what they could resell using that API. So what was interesting is their partners, they had like 12 of them, were saying, it's just every couple of weeks, there's a bunch of bad book IDs. They were called ISBNs, I believe. There's just a bunch of bad ISBNs. And so the publisher was like, well, that's not possible. It comes directly from like our database. Well, long story short, what was really interesting is that they were using an API manager that would cache the partner API. But they would update the database every 2 weeks and forget to clear that cache. And that's not a huge hack. But the way we found it was that instead of just testing that partner endpoint that gave you a bunch of ISBNs, because there's no way to know that those might be out of print or bad. The way to know is because they also had an endpoint that allowed you to search that ISBN for the details about that product. So by using the first API call with all the lists, and then randomly choosing thousands of those and diving into them individually, our tests would fire. I think it was actually every morning around 7 a.m., hundreds of bad books. And so that's when they're able to realize, like, oh, that's the issue. But it's because they weren't connecting those two dots. If you just test those two endpoints on their own, you've found nothing. And so by doing this smarter, like consumer level API test, we found something that isn't a failure of the API. The two APIs did what they needed to do. It was just a misconfiguration or just like a small oversight, but it lasted for months. And they had no idea, because at the time they were just testing one endpoint on its own at a time.
Yeah, and I think that's it also speaks to the caching layer as well, right? We often, when we're doing our troubleshooting, etc., and we provide a fix, and then they come back with the same sort of errors again, it's always generally regarding the caching layer. Whether that's, so Dream Factory again doesn't cache by default. It's an advanced setting that you can actually enable for certain criteria, but we also integrate with caching tools. So you might have a Redis cache layer on top of your database that we can then integrate with. And yeah, I think that's a really good point about just having the visibility into that sort of process is important.
Yeah, I mean, if you turn on rate limiting, and if you turn on caching, make sure you have a test in production validating the two are working as expected always, period. Because this is how you will get a breach. If you have a rate limit, test it. And people are afraid, like I hear this pushback, like, well, what's going to mess up our numbers on production? We suggest people just run these tests once every 5 minutes. And if you're a large enterprise, which is the sort of companies I think you and I both work with, one execution every 5 minutes does not kill the analytics. Like it's fine. And you could just tell the analytics team, we'll take out, 300 of those 2 billion
Yeah.
calls that happened
If
yesterday.
if it's consistent and planned, and if it's part of your plan, then it should be well known enough
Yeah.
to discount.
And you could also build something in. So like we have some customers that want to test like a post to create a new user, but that's going to fill up the database with like bad users. But what if you just create a rule whereby at the end of the day, there's a cron job that deletes all users with the name Patrick Poole, gone. Then that fixes itself. So they're actually testing it and they're making sure it doesn't mess up the database. When I worked in mobile e-commerce, we knew all of our customers, we made sure they had the 4 and the 15 ones credit card, which allowed you for credit card number 4 and 15 ones, allowed you to process the order, but nothing got shipped. On the back end, it knew to shut it down, but it also knew to process it as if it's real. And so that was a significant thing. And it's a bit of a sidebar, but on my first week, I didn't know about that trick, and I just typed in like an actual credit card number, like the company's card number, and I forgot to like not do that final checkout, and I ordered 30 televisions overnight. For like it was my first week at this new job, and it was a bad day.
Yeah, good luck explaining that.
And I was just like, yeah, that was my first exposure to testing, and right out of the gate, I screwed it up. So that's when I realized the importance of being good at testing and not just being a guy trying to test. Like you want practice, you want to learn things when you're doing it. So again, just those core smart, really smart tests they're testing rate limiting, they're testing functionality, they're testing consumer flows. Use it for monitoring, as automated testing, and use it for load testing. And this is possible. You can create your own suite that does this. There are platforms out there like API Fortress that do this. That's it. And that will, according to Gartner, 95% of these huge breaches are things that can be caught by just doing these basic levels of tests. I'm not saying you need API Fortress to do this. I'm saying a lot of people build their own process. Just do the process though, and make sure you're considering all of these objects.
And when it comes to, say, the cost of such platforms, I think one thing people won't necessarily review is the opportunity cost of not, right? So if we look back to those examples of Twitter, the opportunity cost that actually occurred to their brand, to the actual cost associated with fixing the breach and then rehabilitating the system. We've had reports of clients recently losing up to 60% of their on-prem servers from a cyber attack. And not to say that would have been prevented by having something like API Fortress, but when you look at now the cost they're going to bear to fix that, what security controls did we have in place in the first instance that may have cost us something that seemed to be just funneling money away to something that wasn't giving us anything? But the actual fact is, when that risk event occurs and you don't have the right control measures in place, then the consequences can be catastrophic, right? And then the subsequent cost of that is, through the roof. So I feel like that's something we sometimes miss when we have those discussions about what might be seen as a nice to have, like a monitoring dashboard. But in actual fact, the opportunity cost of not having it is going to be far greater than what you're paying for it in the first instance.
Exactly. And one thing, sort of a rule of thumb I like to talk to potential customers is, if you're spending $1 million on building new APIs, like you're spending $1 million on a platform and put together a thing. All right, it's $1 million. We're building new APIs. It's costing us $1 million. Well, why do you think testing it should be $0? Why shouldn't it be a percentage of what you're? So just take a percentage, an actual real chunk percentage of what you're going to spend on building, and also put that into testing. So if your budget is $1 million, well, maybe you want to find $1.25 million, or maybe just do 750 and 250. But like, think about an actual percentage value worth and dedicate that to testing. And that might be just in increasing headcount. That might be just in rebuilding your testing suite so everyone's using the same thing. Like, I can't tell you how many hours are lost by there's a group of 5 developers with 1 QA, and all of those groups are doing different things to test and they can't work together. So somebody takes the week off or is let go, all of those tests are unusable if they wrote it in a language only they know at the organization. It's a waste of time. Like, standardize it across the organization and consider an actual budget for it in some capacity for something.
Yeah. But even back at the very start of the project plan, including that as part of your functional requirements before closure, right? When we're talking about actual project documentation, just acknowledging the fact that you need that as a measure, as opposed to just an API platform in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it's too often it comes in as an afterthought, but more and more we're seeing where people are actually coming to us as they're making their decision on these API like gateways and so forth. Like it's all part of the same plan, and they're budgeting for all of it. Because if you're a manager, you're gonna have a lot of trouble convincing your team that just gave you 4 million to give you another 500,000 for this thing you forgot about. You need to make it work for your budget. So consider all of the items first, and don't sleep on testing or monitoring or load testing. So those are all going to be part of it. Those are all needed.
Agreed.
So the next part, just show me how. We already went through it a lot, so I don't need to say much, but like check every single object, check the data associated. So like you'll see there's a URL, image URL. You need to validate that that's actually a URL, not just that image URL exists and that there's something there. You can actually actively validate that. Like make sure, like, so color. If your organization knows that like these objects only come in red and gray, test that it's red and gray. Like if you're using a platform or you've built a platform that's robust enough to like do the job well, you'll be able to do those sorts of things where if it's a pair of pants, these should be the size range. Like that's the level of testing you should have. It doesn't have to be your test on day one, but you can continually iterate, like write a bunch of D tests and then make them C's, B's, and iterate and make them smarter and smarter over time. But not only like writing one good test, but as I was saying prior, connecting them. So using an API as the data that informs the subsequent call. So you've got actually this sort of a testing workbench. So it's more interactive. So if it's a positive, if it's a 200, this is what we expect. If it's a 401, we expect this, and actually creating some like nesting within it and actually creating something that's really intelligent. So you get the whole flow of search, add to cart, checkout. You want that to work in one test, as well as doing the individual tests. So again, just I know I'm reiterating myself over and over again, but it's literally as simple as you want everyone in your organization using the same tool, language, product, whatever it is, so they can work together, so there's efficiencies, and using it for all aspects, including production monitoring, internal monitoring, and load testing. You want those functional tests used as that. Everyone knows about functional tests as part of a CI, like automated testing. But those two other pieces are totally being ignored, or they're being pushed into other platforms that don't give you the actual level of testing you need to do the job well. Because if you're doing monitoring, so this is a good example, but like when we talk about monitoring, people often say like, oh, we got Datadog or New Relic or App Dynamics. Those platforms do not validate the functionality of an API. If you actually Google API testing, they have the keyword on there, but you'll see that they add the word synthetic. It's the bare minimum. It'll check a 200 and maybe like a content type for you. Like it does the bare minimum. It doesn't do the search, add to cart, checkout, because that's not their business. They're expanding the platform and trying to get into it and grab more dollars and making themselves stickier. But the platforms that exist today, that like the top 5 monitoring platforms, are not good at monitoring APIs, period. They're just bad at it. But there's a bunch of really good API testing platforms that can monitor. And the people that are using the API testing platforms are your domain knowledge experts of the API. Your monitoring team is a totally different team that probably knows nothing about what the APIs are supposed to do functionally. So why are you asking them to monitor them and make sure that they're functionally working properly in production? That's a different team. Because it's one thing to work with startups. We work with large organizations. There's a complete division of state, and it's completely given to, so whoever runs App Dynamics of your company, that's a completely different person than the one that knows how to do search, add to cart, checkout, and what the load test should be and what the functionality should be. So just all of those things, monitoring, performance testing, all of that stuff, when we're talking about APIs, should be one team. It's not the same when we're talking UI. Like UI monitoring, it's a little bit easier, a little more lighter weight. I think you should be doing functional monitoring in the UI as well, but like APIs at their core, that's just data and information. You need to validate it to make sure that it's useful, and then use that continuously. Like, so when a lot of people are shifting to Agile and CI/CD, API testing runs throughout that entire chain. And to sort of like at the end, sort of really reiterate this, like the buzzword is like shift right, shift left. They talk about all those things. Shift left means mocking, allegedly, but they're not consistent on that. Well, shift right's more important. Even more important than that is shifting right, which means using your automated tests in production. And so what we mean by that is your APIs are not just up, but they're up and functioning using that level of detail test that we were talking about before. And really be careful not to be stuck using CSVs. We see it every day where someone has a CSV they've been using for 10 years. That's all they use to test. You're using, like, that might have been okay when you're talking like UI testing, but now with APIs, by definition, an API is data. Why not use the data of one API to inform the subsequent API? It's so rare that we see people create tests like that, but when they do it, it's unbelievable how robust they are, and they're super dynamic. So you start catching things you don't expect, because what we were saying earlier is an API test can catch stuff far beyond just whether or not the API is giving you the information properly. What if in production, people have to upload items to the website, like it's an eBay or an Etsy, and they're doing it wrong because the website team messed up the upload of that? That's actually an example on our blog. It's a huge like problem they had. They had thousands of items that weren't found on the website because the website upload team, who was a completely different team, screwed up and didn't require a category. Such a small thing, but an API test can actually catch something like that. So again, just search, add to cart, check out, the whole consumer flow. This actually goes more into like the Dream Factory side of things. Like for us, we always hear like, what's a good uptime? 99.8 seems pretty good to us, but we're saying like that's functional uptime. And really just, it's what you guys want. And don't forget the importance of internal functional uptime. A lot of that stuff runs internally, and your business depends on not just the partner API, but all of the internal ones.
Yeah, 100%. I think when we talk about what's a good API and where Dream Factory sort of leans into this space, and I guess I'll move back to your one of your final points there about the whole functional testing and the consistency of APIs, I guess, across the board. Dream Factory, we hang our hat on our ability to auto-generate REST APIs for all common data sources, databases, and we can spin up a fully documented API with secure endpoints in a couple of minutes, which is great. And we have some clients that we do that. They can do that programmatically through the platform as well. So you can automatically spin up new services based off your interaction with the platform. We also then have the ability to customize that API even further and script it using several different languages, apply some sort of customization to the workflow, and then still present that up as an API. To your point of constantly testing that production environment, if you are customizing a standard API that Dream Factory has been able to auto-generate, then that functional testing in production environment becomes even more important. And that's, again, where our core value sits around the API creation. Tools like API Fortress running alongside Dream Factory and integrating with Dream Factory are obviously something we support as a not only an additional security and monitoring layer, but just common sense when it comes to programmatically spinning up, say, 600 services, which is what one of our clients actually has in a production environment, and continually spinning up new services as, say, a product is logged on an inventory management system or shipped out the door. There's a definite case for running something like API Fortress alongside an automatic API generation tool. I think from other tools that are outside Dream Factory, where you can actually build the API from scratch, it becomes even more important because you're not having a consistent standardized base to start from. With Dream Factory, you're going to get all your MySQL, SQL Server endpoints, all standardized, your tables, the flows, and it's there ready to go, full swagger documentation. If you're building that from the ground up, inherently we look back to that human flaw element of the build, the handover of that API into someone who maybe not be familiar with why the API was built the way it was in the first instance, what it's actually communicating. And we've still got that running in production during that handover phase even, right? So the security and maintenance of that API becomes even more important after you've customized it. So I guess my point there being is, Patrick, everything you've covered today is obviously very much in line with best practice API management from our perspective as an API management platform, as an instant API generator, and more so the ability to build on top of what is an auto-generated API from Dream Factory, obviously then pushes the further requirement to monitor and continually test to make sure that API is doing what it needs to do.
Yeah, 100%. Actually, that's one of the things why we created this this checklist, because what we're seeing more and more is people are thinking about testing, but what they do is they're committing to a poor way to test, and they're working so hard to do it, and eventually they hit a wall and they have to restart everything. So we see this the most often with people that like just are using Postman. Postman does many things well. Testing is not one of them. And if you're committing to using Postman, number one, your tests aren't good enough. Number two, you can't load tests. There's no privacy. Like they store stuff in the cloud. Like we actually have an on-prem version in the cloud. Postman's very good for a lot of things. It is not good for testing. And if you're committing yourself to it right now for testing, you're going to realize in 3 months that you made a mistake. So we created this checklist of all the things that we know that if you want an actual like testing solution that's serious, you need to keep all of this stuff in mind. And some of it may not apply to you, some of it may, but it's all stuff to consider, because if you just jump in without knowing what to expect in the future, having to rebuild it from scratch is going to be a real pain in the butt, and it might just lead to you delaying it further and further. So know that there needs to be budget, know that you have to plan for it. And since all we do is test and work with enterprises that made the mistake and then come to us as they're making the decision, we have a pretty good idea of what this checklist should be. So we're always updating it. I think it's a Google spreadsheet actually. So it's definitely worth checking out if you're thinking about your new API program.
Yeah, and that actually ties into an initiative we have at the moment. Is we've developed our own security checklist that we run internally with our clients. We run that either monthly, quarterly, whatever their cadence may be. But this is almost the checklist you're proposing here sits at the very front end of that design and implementation phase, right? And in essence, if that sort of checklist had been implemented, our security checklist has probably become a moot point, because it's just then a tick and flick to make sure it's still occurring, right? What we're finding is the reason we developed our checklist is because we're moving into the client side, where in which there are vulnerabilities or not optimized environments in the API space that we have to sort of prompt to say, oh, look, actually, here's a way you can do this better, and here's how Dream Factory can enable it. Whereas I think like your checklist would indicate, if that control measure had been put in place at the start, it's going to alleviate a lot of that. And obviously having the ongoing monitoring and testing off the back of that checklist, it almost makes our security checklist irrelevant, because it should be getting done from the very start. So
yeah, but again, it should also be like monitored constantly, like doing it every month, a big check every month. Like you and I were talking about that before this even started, about we have an internal meeting every 20 minutes just to keep something messed up once, and we learned that if we don't keep an eye on it weekly, so we have a repeatable meeting every week about that sort of thing. So like checklists like that make a lot of sense, because it's just checking in production. At the end of the day, it's human beings checking things in production. Like you should have monitors in production, but you should also have eyeballs and humans in production. It's not just set it and forget it, especially with APIs, because it's all using dynamic data and things change and iterate constantly.
And if you've got multiple APIs, or multiple services on a single platform, and 600,000, whatever it might be, if you don't have that check or that monitoring in place, and one of them goes down, it may get lost in the weeds, in that you don't see it as part of the overall volume, but it may have been performing a critical function at low volume, right? It may not have been a high traffic API, but the data that it was moving was incredibly important. So it's uncaught downtime, I think, would be one of those key terms that's associated with that, right?
Yeah, it's hugely expensive to not know what you don't know, but you can know it for pretty cheap if you just like plan out properly. And that's what your checklist, my checklist, like there's checklists out there from people like us. Like we're not saying you have, like, our checklist is completely agnostic, and I'm sure yours is too. It's just, this is just basic stuff. Whether you want to use our platform or not, doesn't matter. It's basic stuff. please do it, because I'm probably using your platform and I would like people not to have all of my banking info. So
Yeah.
I appreciate all banks, even if they don't use API Fortress, to just have a pretty good testing plan in place.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Well, Patrick, we won't necessarily dive into Dream Factory and API Fortress in this demonstration, but Jason and I are hosting a further talk regarding connecting and securing the enterprise via APIs, and we'll definitely be covering that in there as to how an enterprise API infrastructure absolutely needs monitoring, performance measurement, and functional testing, right? Not only in pre-prod, but in that prod environment too. So we'll cover in that presentation how exactly a tool like API Fortress can be used alongside instant API generation, API management in Dream Factory, and how they can really lift that security layer to optimize that security layer to avoid that unnecessary expense that will inevitably come with the downtime or the cyber attack that comes in and shuts you down because you weren't watching, right? So yeah, I invite our attendees to join us on that presentation, and we'll go through it in more detail. But Patrick, thanks so much for your time, mate. This has been a great presentation. We really appreciate what API Fortress are doing, and we obviously have spoken about a continued engagement with Dream Factory. So I invite all our attendees to visit API Fortress and give it a look and understand really the true value of what your tool brings to a robust API, led strategy.
Great. Well, I appreciate the time, and thanks a lot. I really appreciate the time to discuss Dream Factory and API Fortress, and more specifically, like, just make sure our APIs that are running the things that we use in our personal lives are going well.
Right. Thanks, Patrick. Cheers.